I'm really excited to welcome all of our guest speakers today who are from a range of diverse backgrounds and sectors, but basically strung together by the key theme of engaging with policy in the UK. My name is Hana Morel, and I'm the organizer of today's event, which is hosted by the AHRC Heritage Priority Area and Rescue, the British Archaeological Trust, which I'd just like to introduce now. Today's conference forms part of a wider set of activities within the AHRC Heritage Priority Area, which is led by Professor Rodney Harrison as Leadership Fellow, with Hannah Williams, Colin Sterling, and myself as part of the team. The priority area has an exciting and wide remit, which you can see some of them here, the themes, and you can look at it in detail online more, but perhaps I can sum it up with our main objectives as exploring and researching heritage across what is occasionally viewed by some as unrelated themes. So that might be the current global challenges and sustainable development goals, climate change, the UK relationship with Europe, big data, new technologies, social change, and other areas such as inclusion, exclusion, post-humanities, and heritage's relationship with the future. For this event in particular, it forms one of the many activities aimed to draw together academics, civil servants, private and professional bodies, and of course civil society organizations to address some of the challenges and uncertainty from the many changing policies we've seen over the years and the many more that we'll see in the coming future. For Rescue, that some of you may know, is an independent registered charity which has consistently campaigned for the protection of the historic environment since the 1970s. This event acts as yet another stepping stone that enables us to pull together and use our collective resources and research to bettering the future of the environment through active participation in consultations and calls for evidence and so on. So I just want to contextualize or perhaps expand on the reason for today's event, as well as give an idea of what we hope to explore today. A lot of our sectors work within a system based on policy rather than legislation. And that's not to say that legislation doesn't exist. It does. But the direction of travel that we've seen policy going increasingly appears to put current provisions under threat. Over the years, we've seen government propose a range of changes in policy, and generally we are offered the opportunity to respond and offer evidence to these changes through official consultations and call for evidence. And this does make a difference. To name just a few, we've had consultations on the National Planning Policy Framework, the Neighbourhood Planning Bill, the Rainsford Review on Planning, the Museum Review, the Select Committee on Citizenship and Civic Engagement, call for evidence on how to build bridges between and within communities, the Environment Bill, and many, many more can be added to that list. We also, in what could be viewed as a positive gain, have recently seen the creation of the Heritage Council group, which is supposed to be a cross-governmental, cross-departmental group in Parliament, suggesting government's commitment to ensure greater coordination and a stronger voice for heritage. So as practitioners, academics, and civil servants that are impacted by revisions and proposals to policy, or even simply as citizens, we have a part to play in providing the necessary information and data, or even simply vocalizing our concerns to help change how these acts and guidelines look like. There has been a growing strong appetite for evidence-led policy intervention within the sector, and that really needs to coincide with the recognition that advocacy starts with all of us. It's that logic which informed the 3 sessions today. We wanted to explore how we could proactively encourage the building of culture and the protection of the historic and natural environment into the planning system, but also recognize the changing role of culture, museums, and the arts, and what that might mean for society, communities, and networks. We also wanted to address the issue of action. What sort of research do we need? What provisions are we lacking? What is it that we need to do to help think about the long-term future of our sectors? Hopefully, our last session will help think about that a bit further. But also in the program, you'd probably notice that we have put plenty of time for discussion at the end of each session. And we've got actually a really fantastic range of people in our audience, so ask your questions, simple ones, long ones, provocative ones, and even the it's more of a comment than a question ones. So it might be worth going back to my suggestion that today includes this overarching notion of governance. I think understanding governance is important, and basically it's about processes. So for instance, you might say governance can be about delving into the patterns of coordination or ways of organization, which can be completely independent from the state. It's about linkages with or between different sectors or stakeholders, so that could be obviously society, public bodies, private bodies, voluntary bodies, and so on. It's relevant today because it's these processes that are a cause and product of changes. This includes changes in and to the state to basically a move away from that more traditional structure of government and institutions that we know to this hybrid organism of partnerships and networks, which is a bit more porous with permeable boundaries across interest areas. And that's what this is really about, bringing together a wider plurality of voices or a plurality of stakeholders to the decision-making process and also to policy implementation. It's about working alongside each other and perhaps even formally collaborating with one another rather than basing these sorts of things on informal relationships. And at the same time, instead of relying on institutions and organizations to deliver efficient and effective governance, we can certainly hope for a shift towards revitalizing democracy by exploring innovative ways to encourage participation in all the various stages of policymaking. That includes empowering marginalized groups, disadvantaged groups, or even simply empowering quieter and smaller groups to enter the policymaking process and to push for more engagement and dialogue in general, so that people from all walks of life can actually understand the targets of these policies we see emerging. In hosting this conference, we're pleased to have the contributions from a wide range of representatives, including those involved with the natural environment, historic environment, museums, the arts, and of course those that have simply been involved in the finer sense of the word for over the decades. I hope that participants both on stage and off benefit from bringing together these strands of important policy changes that are often seen as disconnected and recognize the value of addressing or perhaps engaging with these changes through cross-sectorial perspective, or in an ideal situation, an integrated approach. I'm pleased that we have speakers who can address core issues, but also that our speakers today break some of the concerns to the lack of gender balance we've seen in so many of these events. But yes, we still have a lot more work to do to ensure more diversity is seen through events such as these. And I add that that is no easy task, but that difficulty should never ever be used as an excuse. On behalf of AHRC Heritage and Rescue, I hope that today's presentations and discussions contribute towards the wider initiatives we see taking place across various relatable sectors to encourage effective engagement with decision-making processes happening on an ongoing basis. As a more personal ambition, I hope this conference, among many other activities we see across the UK, helps encourage universities to become more involved and active with the wider community, or indeed a sort of civic institution in their own right. I would also like to point out for those of you who'd like to tweet, we do have a hashtag which is engaging with policy. I'm now thrilled to introduce Professor and Lord Colin Renfrew. Professor Renfrew is of course known for his leading work as a British archaeologist. He was Disney Professor of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge and Director of the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research before retirement. He is Fellow of the British Academy and the Society of Antiquaries in London, as well as Honorary Fellow of the SOCANS in Scotland. He is also Foreign Associate of the National Academy of Sciences. While Professor Renfrew is known for his work on prehistory and almost every other archaeological area, we were incredibly pleased that he agreed to speak with us today in the capacity of his role in Parliament with his ongoing advocacy towards the protection of the historic environment. If you've ever followed his work and participation in Parliament, you will know he's been key within the All-Party Parliamentary Archaeology Group, as well as the All-Party Parliamentary Group for the Protection of Cultural Heritage. He's also been consistent with his parliamentary appearances in defense of the historic environment. So, for example, he has advocated a separate amendment to the withdrawal bill to deal with protecting archaeological and historical concerns and the strengthening of the position of archaeology and cultural heritage. With the neighborhood planning bill, he highlighted that cultural and historic resources are always under threat and that some of the bill's provisions would endanger the safeguarding of these resources under the current planning system. He's also spoken up for archaeology and the history of art's removal from the examination curriculum, asked government what steps are being taken to ensure that LPAs continue to provide archaeological advice to planners and planning applicants, advocated for the historic environment record to be a statutory duty, questioned Her Majesty's government when Her Majesty's government expects to introduce legislation to ratify both the 1954 Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of an armed conflict, as well as the 2001 UNESCO Convention for the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage, and has been a spokesperson for much, much more, such as concerns about the looting of world archaeological sites to the VAT liabilities of museums and galleries. And so, without further delay, please welcome Lord Colin Renfrew to the stage, who will talk on challenges and opportunities for the heritage in international perspective.
And it's a curious circumstance that although Britain and England within it, England and Wales within it, has always had a real interest in the historic heritage, that interest has not always been very well expressed, and has not always been very well expressed at a national level. And so it is that while we do have elements of legislation which are crucial to the protection of the cultural heritage, we have nothing very coherent and nothing very wide-ranging as heritage legislation. It's grown up piecemeal, and it's grown up piecemeal through the interest of the public, which is very important, but the interest of the public does need to find a coherent voice, and I think increasingly since Rescue was formed in 1971, Rescue has been a very important part of that voice, and this conference is significant in that respect, and towards the end of the conference we should be considering what more Rescue can be doing, and it's worth bearing in mind, I think, that although one doesn't need to write to one's MP about everything, in fact it only takes a number of letters on a particular theme to a specific MP to rise above the threshold where the MP takes attention. And something like 20 or 30 letters to an MP, to a specific MP, really brings a matter to that MP's attention. Of course, the letters to be of relevance to the MP need to be from constituents, so that's no small piece of organisation to bring that about, but it can be really impressively effective. Now, it wasn't until 1882 that Sir John Lubbock, who later became Lord Avebury, succeeded in introducing and then having passed in the House of Commons the first heritage legislation, which was the Ancient Monuments Act. And that, I think, was a very successful piece of work. And Britain, I think, has been ambiguous in its attitude to the heritage. There has a long and strong tradition of caring for Britain's antiquities, for the British countryside. These are part of the background for many Britons, perhaps most Britons, and caring for the remains of the past are a significant part of that. But in fact, actions of any kind to bring those feelings to the fore and to express them publicly by some institutional act have always been delayed. So it's in some ways surprising, I think, that the first Ancient Monuments Act was as late as 1882, and it was a significant moment, I think, in the post-war, post-Second World War environment, when a number of individuals and concerns came together with the formation of Rescue, the Trust for British Archaeology. Public policy has developed often quite wisely, but often rather late, and often, I think, rather ineffectively. So as we review, and that's what I'm proposing to do in these introductory words, in this introductory talk, it's worth bearing in mind how public awareness has focused in different ways, the development of television, for instance, and archaeology on television has in general been successful, fortunately, has caught the public interest, but in a not terribly well organized way. And so one of the main points that I'm wanting to emphasize today is that public interest in archaeology and public action in archaeology has happened, and the situation up to now is far from disastrous, although I think there are grounds for concern with Brexit, and I'm not going to dwell unduly on Brexit, but it's natural that when so little is resolved about our manner of leaving the European Union, issues of cultural heritage are not at the forefront. And so one of the conclusions, which I hope will arise from this meeting, is that we all have to keep our eyes on the Brexit process. We of course have different opinions amongst us on whether we're leavers, whether we're remainers and so on. I'm not going to go into that at all. But in the Brexit process, there needs to be a proper concern for the historic environment, and that concern is at the moment disorganized, and although efforts are being made on various sides, not least by Historic England needs our strong support in this enterprise if we are going to make progress at this time, which I think is perilous for the cultural heritage, because, as I say, so little is resolved, and the government, not surprisingly, will have its eye on other issues, including major economic concerns and so on, as Brexit is negotiated, and presumably there's a deal, but the nature of the deal, as we know, is not going to be debated extensively in Parliament, and so heritage concerns risk being in the second or third rank of the focus of public and particularly of government attention. So this is a delicate time in a number of ways. The shadow of indecision about Brexit hangs over us, and will probably do so beyond March the 29th of next year, when Brexit should formally take place. And with those uncertainties certainly come uncertainties about the successor to the common agricultural policy and several other things. And I hope in this meeting attention will be given in some detail to the common agricultural policy and whatever may succeed it, because when we're talking about the rural landscape, obviously the common agricultural policy is central. The new national planning policy framework has not yet bedded down, and its consequences are not yet clear. The guidance of PPG 16 was, as it did settle down, clear and helpful. But the government, in its perhaps laudable wish of making planning easier to organise and to execute, and that in a general sense is clearly a good intention, to minimise bureaucracy, make planning and make planning consent easier to obtain, so building can proceed without all the delays which have been deplored. That has weakened some of the safeguards which has sustained us for some years. So, of course, it's wrong to be too cynical about government, but in general, I think it's fair to say that the issues of conserving the cultural heritage have never been at the front of government concerns. I can think of only one Secretary of State who I think was personally engaged and interested, and that was Michael Heseltine, who was responsible for setting up the original Historic Buildings and Monuments Commission for England, which later on adopted the name for itself of English Heritage. And that was an act by Michael Heseltine, which was well intentioned and in many ways I think had positive results. But I can't think of any other Secretary of State since that time who's taken a close personal interest in the concerns of the cultural heritage. There are ministers who've done so under Secretaries of State, like Ed Vasey, for example, who I think was seriously interested and committed to concerns for the heritage. But unless you're at cabinet level, unless you're a Secretary of State, you don't carry very much clout, I'm afraid. I've seen the it's worth mentioning that the provision, and it's an important point to make, the provision for expert archaeological advice in county planning offices, which is a fundamental strength of the system in England and Wales, is diminished when significant skilled personnel are not replaced. And similarly, one of the key advances of recent years, namely the national provision of find liaison officers, is subject to attrition. Now, this is inescapable. Governments want to save money. They want to save money across the board. And so this is a process which isn't particularly surprising, but it's one which we should keep our eye on, and which Rescue and other organisations should be working out how at the right time they draw attention to this and draw attention to the negative consequences. I've seen the slow pace of progress since I was first appointed to the Ancient Monuments Board sometime around 1972, as I remember. So I've been looking at these processes for a long time, and the general pattern is clear. It is well-meaning, but it is not always very much more than that. And unfortunately, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, DCMS, is not one of the strong departments in government, has not generally had a very high-powered Secretary of State, and so the views of the DCMS, while well-intentioned in general, have not always been very effectively carried forward. I was then appointed to the Historic Buildings and Monuments Commission when it was first set up under the chairmanship of Lord Montagu of Beaulieu in 1983. And that certainly brought in new people, and I have great admiration for the late Lord Montagu, who was a very effective advocate. But it only could go so far, and I'm going to use Stonehenge as an example in my talk today, because Stonehenge, when I joined the Ancient Monuments Board, I say around 1972, that of course was when the A344 ran straight through more or less the centre, or generally through key parts of the monument, and that was adopted by members of the Ancient Monuments Board as a sort of flagship concern. Then when the Historic Buildings and Monuments Commission for England was set up in 1983 under Lord Montagu, he made that a concern, a flagship concern. Then when he retired from that position and was succeeded by Jocelyn, what's his name, Stevens, he after making a few rather negative remarks about bumps in fields, which I didn't feel very, very helpful, he then adopted Stonehenge as a flagship issue. But flagship issue or not, nothing very much happened. Fortunately, in the end, perhaps say in the end is rather a negative statement, but in the end, the A344 was indeed closed to traffic, and the Stonehenge Visitor Centre, which I think was a wonderful development, was set up. So that was real progress in that Stonehenge no longer had a major car park as its sort of principal curiosity beside the stones themselves. And you may remember in those days having to walk under a tunnel underneath the A344 to get to the monument. Well, happily those days have changed, but as you're very much aware, the issue of the future of the A303 and whether there's a tunnel and how long the tunnel should be is still active. So it is, I think, an indication of the low, I don't mean low esteem, but the secondary esteem. This is point. In Britain we have a great tradition of caring about our cultural heritage, and then a great tradition of not doing very much about it, to summarise. So I think it is a public scandal. I mean, Stonehenge has been a public scandal for many years. It's interesting that it was donated to the nation. As you may have heard, I was reminded by listening to that on Radio 4 yesterday, exactly a century ago, as a very generous act. But Stonehenge remains, the way we've treated Stonehenge remains a national scandal. And it's a very good example that improvements have been brought. The A344 has been closed, a visiting centre has been constructed, so all those are positive. And yet, despite all that, the issue of the A303, whether it will go into a tunnel, how long the tunnel will be, is still under discussion after several decades, since 1972. That's I don't know how many years, but I've been seeing those discussions going on all that time, and they've still not been resolved. As co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group with Tim Lawton MP, I'm well aware of the problems that remain. And I would say there that I've read papers emanating from Rescue which are critical of the all-party parliamentary group for not doing enough. And in a way that's a warranted criticism, but it is an all-party group, that's its merit, and so it can only really be a ginger group. and an all-party parliamentary group, it's the all-party parliamentary group for archaeology that I'm referring to, doesn't really have much power. It can simply bring together interested MPs and interested peers and encourage them to raise issues in Parliament. That is an important concern, and one of my messages today, which I've already expressed to you, is that at the right time, urging on your local MPs that they should take an interest in an issue is an important way forward. Among the concerns of the all-party parliamentary group is the restoration programme for the Palace of Westminster. And as you know, in a few years, MPs and peers will move out of the Palace of Westminster so that this restoration programme can be carried forward. But many of you may recall the disaster which befell the old Saxon and medieval Palace of Westminster when the House of Commons car park was excavated. Because, of course, the Palace of Westminster, Houses of Commons and Lords, is built on the remains of the old Palace of Westminster, which goes back to Saxon times. And one of the strange ironies is that because the Palace of Westminster has responsibility for its own planning, it's not part of Westminster County Council, or whatever the term, Westminster City Council, not subject to the planning department of Westminster City Council. When they decided to build the House of Commons car park, they just went ahead without any separate planning permission, heritage considerations, and so many of the remains of which survived in the car park area were simply dug away to construct the House of Commons car park. Well, that's an old story, but there is the risk that the same could happen again, and the House of Lords car park is a small enough area, but it is one of the areas of the old Palace of Westminster that has not been dug into to any deep level, and so that is a matter which I hope we're going to keep under review, because that would be a particular tragedy. And as I say, it is an irony that the House of Commons and the House of Lords, it was the House of Commons car park, of course, was responsible for destroying a key part of London's heritage, Britain's heritage, there in the Palace of Westminster. And indeed, confidence has not been inspired by the decision, which you may have read of in the press just recently, of selling tiles, encaustic tiles, from the Palace of Westminster to the public for £200 apiece. Well, I believe that decision has been rescinded now, but that such a decision could be reached in terms of commercialization without going through the proper procedures. The proper procedures would have included offering them to the Victoria and Albert Museum and other procedures. There are procedures for such things. These procedures were apparently not followed when that offer was made public. And that is just an example of what I'm saying, that we can have protective legislation. We do have some good protective legislation, although some is coming under question through Brexit, and yet it's not always followed. So it's excellent that a number of people, including Mike Hayworth of the Council for British Archaeology, a number of people spotted this, and enough fuss was made that decision has been rescinded. That's a small enough issue, tiles from the Palace of Westminster, but it's an example of how, because these matters are not always at the very forefront of public concern, they can go so badly wrong. Well, all this is rather a cautious introduction to my central theme today, that Britain has for centuries been alive to the importance of interest of the historic antiquities of the nation, and more recently to their place in the historic environment, taking a wider view, thinking of context and thinking of landscape rather than just locations. Camden's Britannia was published in 1586 in Latin and then in 1610 in the English language, and since that time, with the topographic records of John Aubrey and William Stukely, there has been a lively awareness of the material remains of Britain's past. And the establishment of the Society of Antiquaries of London in the year 1707 is a token of that. It received its royal charter in 1757. So let us remember that it was the widespread interest in antiquities which underlay these researches and publications, and that this was in the best sense an amateur interest, an interest of the public who were lovers of their environment and of the historic environment. And so it was that local antiquarian societies were founded and indeed published their proceedings. And if one's looking at the documentation for Britain's heritage, much of it lies in the publications of the local antiquarian societies, some of them quite small, like the Society of Gentlemen of Spalding, which you may remember is one of those societies. And the interests of landowners, not least General Augustus Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers, the first inspector of ancient monuments, led them to excavate and to found the collections which are now in our regional museums. And it's very happy that the Salisbury and South Wiltshire Museum contains General Pitt Rivers models and the records of his excavations in the vast tract of land at Cranbourne Chase, of which he was the personal owner. The international dimension was met by the foundation of the British Museum in 1753, which came to contain important collections from the Near East as well as the Parthenon marbles. But only recently, the past 20 or 30 years, has the British Museum laid comparable emphasis on British antiquities. Of course, it has a wonderful collection in that department now, but the British Museum a century ago did not show much interest in British antiquities, but did have wonderful finds which Rawlinson made in the Near East and others too. And in British terms, the overseas schools focusing on archaeology or partly on archaeology, now under the wing of the British Academy, were founded. The British School at Athens, the Rome School, both those are more than a century old, the Institute at Ankara and others, not to mention the Palestine Exploration Fund and the Egypt Exploration Fund. And these two were initiatives which were public initiatives, not government initiatives. And so the point I'm continuing to emphasize in this talk is the importance of public interest in the past and in archaeology and in Britain's past, expressed in various ways. And that's why I'm emphasizing that the foundation of rescue in 1971 gave stronger public awareness to that interest. So that widespread interest led to the first ancient monuments legislation in 1882, to the first inspector of ancient monuments, and to the twin processes for ancient monuments of guardianship and of scheduling, together with the parallel process of listing for historic buildings. And those still remain the basis, the core of our protection, or a key part of the core. The guardianship monuments, as you know, are the monuments which are in the care of what was then the Ministry of Works, and has had successive names since that time, and now is under the name, after the renaming, of English Heritage. So that is a crucial part of the protection. And these were the principal safeguarding processes until after the Second World War, when the destruction in our ancient cities led to heroic excavations in the 50s and 60s. Early among these were the excavations of Shepherd Freer at Canterbury, and I had a great admiration and fondness for Shepherd Freer. It was under his direction as a schoolboy that I first learned to use a trowel at Canterbury, and that was my first direct experience of archaeology. He went on, of course, to excavate also at Verulamium near St Albans. And then the later generation, around the time that rescue was established, of people like Martin Biddle at Winchester, Peter Adaman at York, Barry Cunliffe at Fishbourne, Graham Webster at Roxeter, and many other people who are in that sense my personal heroes for doing such pioneering excavations and publishing them with varying degrees of promptitude, it must be said. Some of them are not completely published. Winchester Studies continues to produce a magnificent series of publications, but some of them are a little time, some considerable time after the act. But they are the foundations of what we are doing today. A key theme then is public interest. And here I think we should recognize how fortunate it was that some archaeological figures became so widely recognized publicly, and I'm thinking first of all about the original animal, vegetable, mineral program, which any of you who are anything like my age will remember very well with great pleasure, where Glyn Daniel was the chairman and Mortimer Wheeler was one of the stars, and there has been a good tradition of first-class television archaeology since that time, for example with the work of Time Team. And that, I think, both the popularity reflects public awareness, but has also been maintaining public awareness of archaeology. And I think those are an important part of what has become the heritage of public interest in archaeology. And so we should notice the role of publications which traditionally are not just pure scientific publications, but publications that are accessible. And prominent among those, I think first among those, is undoubtedly Antiquity. And it was, of course, O.G.S. Crawford who founded Antiquity, and Glyn Daniel who succeeded him for so many years as editor, and there's been a succession of editors since, including until very recently Chris Scarr. And it was Glyn Daniel who spoke of haute vulgarisation, which he thought was a very good thing, high vulgarization, and that he thought was the role of Antiquity. And then, since that time, of course, we've got current archaeology and current world archaeology, which are also in that really fine tradition of giving public expression to archaeology in a way that is thoroughly professional, but at the same thoroughly accessible. Now, the support organizations are, of course, crucial. And there was concern when the role of the Historic Buildings and Monuments Commission was brought to an end a few years ago and divided into a renamed English Heritage, which is the name given to the organisation which runs essentially the guardianship monuments, and to Historic England, which is the active arm, which is responsible for so much of the archaeology which is undertaken in this country today. And I know we're going to hear from Duncan McCallum later, so I won't expand on that. But I will make reference to the treasure valuation and the treasure legislation. There was a Treasure Act a few years ago, as you know, which brought into the legislative sphere the operation of treasure trove, which had existed since I think the 12th century, but without any very clearly established legal framework. I have the privilege of being chair of the Treasure Valuation Committee at this moment, and so we see, I mean, they're wonderful meetings. We meet about 6 times a year, and you go into the room. They're usually held at the British Museum, which has good security, and all the matters, all the items for consideration are brought before us. So we saw heaps of coins for a large hoard, and gold diadems and whatever comes forward, gold bangles from the Bronze Age and so on. And as you know, the legislation works in such a way that before somebody goes metal detecting on private land, they need to obtain the consent of the landowner, and there's usually an agreement that if something of significance is found, then it's valued, and then the division is 50-50 between landowner and finder. Now, this again I've seen criticised, and indeed I used to be critical of it myself. Doesn't it involve the monetarization of finds? Is it desirable that we should be thinking of archaeological finds in terms of their financial value? Is that really the way we should be approaching these things? And that is the question which I think is quite reasonably and appropriately asked. But on the other hand, we know that such finds can be sold, and indeed those that have been reported, if a museum does not wish to buy them, museums have priority under the Treasure Act, but if no museum wishes to buy such objects, then they are returned to the finder, and then they're sold at auction or on eBay or whatever. And so I think it is impossible to escape the circumstance that such finds have a financial value, and that the financial value is not difficult to estimate. And of course, thank you, we employ commercial valuers at the with the Treasure Committee, Treasure Valuation Committee. We just have one professional valuation if it's a small item. We have 2 if it's a large item, 2 valuations. And if the valuations differ, and they sometimes can do, one valuer can say, oh, we think this find is worth £2,000. Another valuer can say we think it's worth £10,000, and in such a case we sometimes have to commission a third valuation to try and guide the committee. And of course the committee has on it a number of people who do know about values, a number of people who are or have been themselves dealers. So that's a system which works. It can be criticized, but I think the indication that it does work is that we have rather few nighthawks, and indeed nighthawks are not doing themselves any great favor, because if they do find something clandestinely, then they can't dispose of it publicly, so they don't get very much more than if they'd gone through the proper procedures and accepted the 50% of the value. Other problems, I must come to an end now, I must wrap up now. Other problems that need addressing and may be discussed in this meeting are the problem of find storage. When archaeological finds are made, there's a growing problem of where do you store them all. They're a growing resource, these finds made in rescue excavations and so on, but how do we store them? And that is a problem. The publication of indeed, the publication of any excavations is an international problem. Indeed, it's fair to say an international disgrace. So many well-conducted excavations are not published, but certainly the Old English Heritage, now Historic England, gives great encouragement to such publication. And the late Geoffrey Wainwright is one of my great heroes in that field. I think he was terrific at arranging for the publication of excavations and publishing his own. International looting is a great problem, and I remember about 15 years ago asking a question in the House of Lords, is it really true, I knew the answer, is it really true that it is legal to import into Britain antiquities which have been illegally excavated overseas and illegally exported overseas? And Lord Inglewood, who was the minister at the time, had to admit, yes, it was legal to do so. There was no legislation against that. Well, this absurd and disgraceful trading in antiquities has been greatly restricted. As you know, there was a television programme, Inside Sotheby's, and a book which led Sotheby's in the United Kingdom to stop auction sales of antiquities. It was demonstrated that they had they knew they were importing material that had been illegally excavated in Italy and elsewhere, and were selling this at auction, and that has now stopped. And the Dealing in Cultural Objects Offences Act deals with that problem, I think, reasonably efficiently. It was the late Norman Palmer who chaired a committee on that, which brought together dealers and experts and archaeologists, and so the legislation was agreeably appropriate. I should mention also Britain's ratification of the 1970 UNESCO Convention, and also its recent ratification of the 1954 Hague Convention on the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict. But that, I think, I see it's time that I wrapped up. I'll just refer to one other case, but that's a good example where that was 1954, the Hague Convention was passed and passed into international law, but it wasn't until last year that Britain formally acceded to it. And that is an example, I think, of the way that Britain rather bumbles on in a well-meaning way to protect the heritage. We make quite a good job, I think, but it's with delays and hesitancy. I should just mention in passing HMS Victory, 1744, that scandalous case where a namesake and alleged descendant of Admiral Sir Robert Bolton, whose HMS Victory was sunk in the English Channel at that time, 1744, was seeking permission, and indeed the government, I think Jeremy Hunt was the Secretary of State at that time, made the very strange decision to gift the wreck to the Maritime Heritage Foundation, which was under the control of Sir Robert Bolton, the namesake of the original admiral, who is now Lord Lingfield. And his Odyssey marine exploration of Florida set about raising a cannon and so on. But I'm happy to say that through the advocacy of Robert York, who, as a member of the Joint Nautical Agricultural Policy Committee, the Ministry of Defence has now ruled that no further excavation should happen there. Well, there's much more I could be talking about. I could be talking about the scandal of the Sevso treasure. You remember this treasure which was offered for sale at auction by Sotheby's, believed to have been found in Hungary, but its find place is not certain, and actually put on display at Bonham some years ago through some ploy. It's partly owned by the Marquis of Northampton, who was put up to buying it by Peter Wilson of Sotheby's in some ploy to make money, which I think was a discreditable enterprise. So there are many more things that we could talk about, and many things that are not going well, but I will conclude now by saying we have to keep on being aware of these things. We have to protest when things are not going well, and above all we have to keep our eye on the Common Agricultural Policy and its successor. I've not talked in detail about planning, but the big question now for archaeology is what is going to happen to the new the way the new planning system works, and the way money for landowners who do not plough scheduled monuments, the financial compensation which they've received in the past through the Common Agricultural Policy, it's not clear how it is going to be working out in the future. So the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, as they say, and rescue still has a key job to perform at the present time as Brexit unfolds. And so I think there may be times in the near future when you'll need to be writing letters to your MPs. Thank you very much. Well, I think in a general sense they're much the same in the sense of well-meaning people like us make well-meaning points, and I don't think the government is hostile to them, but the DCMS is not a very strong department. But in general I think things have been improving. We've referred to many bits of legislation, the Hague Convention, the Dealing in Cultural Objects Offences Act. So I would say that they've been improving very slowly and gradually, but there is a great threat now, just through mishandling, the whole thing slipping through our fingers with the confusion of the Brexit legislation, or indeed non-legislation, because it's clear there's going to be no great debate about the future of the cultural heritage in the context of Brexit until after Brexit happens. And the preservation under the Common Agricultural Policy is not part of the new Brexit legislation. So I think there's a real risk at the moment in Brexit and its aftermath. If it wasn't for that, I would say we're not doing badly, we're not doing brilliantly well, but there have been gradual improvements. But I think there is the threat, once the implications of Brexit follow through, the threat of a real disaster when planning policy sort of slides backwards, as it might very well do. And so I think that is where we all have to keep our eye on the ball, not just until March the 29th, but for the next year or two, and be ready to be very vocal on these issues. I don't think anybody's trying to do us down in that sense with Brexit. The cultural heritage and the natural environment are not key issues as far as the delivery of Brexit is concerned, but the delivery of Brexit is key to getting it right for those issues. Thank you. I should have been more international in my comments. That was part of my title. I think Greece does particularly well. Greece has a very good framework of legislation. It is true that looting does happen in Greece. Important artifacts are discovered and disposed of through the illicit market in every country. But Greece does have very strong legislation. It has a regional organisation of ephors of antiquities for every district, and it has some very good officials who are well trained. So Greece is very good, whereas Latin America is a disaster. Good things happen in Mexico, but most rural sites are terribly looted, and that certainly happens in Colombia and Peru and so on. So that's the absolute contrast. And other nations, China for instance, because it's a very centralized regime, does quite a good job in preserving its antiquities, but in fact one reads that there are different regions of China which are different kinds of administration. The army in China is very powerful in some areas and does not have a good reputation, so that quite a few illicitly excavated objects emerge from China. So there's a range of nations. I think Britain, like the Scandinavian countries, because we've been concerned about these matters for a couple of centuries now in our legislation, as we've been discussing, I think Britain and those countries do well. And in the United States, it depends. The federal land is well looked after, but other land, unless there's good individual state provisions, is very patchy. But I think the real fright is in South America, where the situation is very bad. In principle, yes. There is a system of compensation, but the truth is it doesn't work very well in Greece. First of all, it's bureaucratically slow. There are complaints in this country that it takes a year or two to come through, because we've got the coroner's court, the rather antiquated business of going before the coroner, but that works well enough in principle. But the scale of compensation in Greece doesn't match the market value. Whereas I think, I can't say because I do know about the treasure valuation process, I think if you find treasure legally, if you've got the landowner's permission in England, then you really do get, or you share with the landowner, if you're a metal detectorist, whatever, you really do get the commercial value. And so if it's £1 million, then you share £1 million, the finder and the landowner, you do really share the value. And so I think Britain is unusual in having a compensation scheme that is a realistic one in that sense.